5.1a, Verifying Trigonometric Expressions, Part 2. So we're still going to be using our Pythagorean identities, so you need to know what those are, which are right here. And we're still going to use the same strategies, but we're going to add a few today. So we're going to look at some of the strategies that are on the bottom today. So starting with number 6. On number 6, you can do this two different ways. The first thing you should recognize is that you have to get rid of the parentheses. So you can either start by substituting this because you have a squared and you have the -1. So we can go to our formulas and use the cosecant formula. So I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to rearrange it to keep my cosecant positive because that's first. So I need to subtract 1. And when I do that, I know that cotangent squared is equal to cosecant squared minus 1. And now I will notice this is exactly the same as this, so I can replace it with the cotangent squared. So now I have tangent squared times cotangent squared. Now I don't have any plus or minus 1s, which is great, and I have tangent and cotangent. So now what I want to do is put everything in terms of sine and cosine using our other strategy. So tangent is equal to sine over cosine, and because that was squared, we got to square both of those. And cotangent is equal to cosine over sine, and again, because it's squared, we'll square both of those. And now you can see through cross reduction, my cosine squareds are going to simplify away to 1, and my sine squareds simplify away to 1, and what I get for an answer is 1 divided by 1, or just 1. All right, you should look at number 10, and on problem number 10, you should pause the video and try it first, but I'll first give you a hint. There's nothing squared with a plus or minus 1. So we have to either put everything in terms of sine or cosine. Well, we are going to have to do that. But first, we have these parentheses here that we have to get rid of. And the only way to get rid of them, because we can't substitute this, is to distribute, which we also could have done from the last problem. So I'm going to distribute first to get rid of those parentheses. And then I'll go ahead and put everything in terms of sine and cosine. Now, in the second part, I have a cosine times a cosine. And what that is just a cosine squared. And remember, the squared goes between the cosine and the x, not after. And now I can put everything in terms of sine and cosine. So I'm going to take and put this in terms of cosine. And this is 1 over cosine. And look at this. My cosines simplify away. And what I get is 1 minus cosine squared. And now I can go to my note sheet, or my formula sheet, I should say, and my only formula was sine squared, or cosine squared, is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And if I rearrange that, keeping the 1 positive, so not touching the 1, I would just have to subtract the cosine squared to both sides. And what I have is this right here is the same as this, so I can replace it with my sine squared. So what this is equal to is sine squared. All right, a new strategy. And this strategy is to find a common denominator and then add the fractions together. So you have to know how to find common denominators. So just a reminder, if I have 1/2 plus 1/3, my denominator has to be the same before I can add them. So I have to find the least common multiple. This least common multiple is 6. So I would have to multiply this by 3 and this by 2. And whatever I do to the bottom, I have to also do to the top. Now I have 3 over 6 plus 2 over 6. Once the denominators are the same, it stays the same, and I only have to add the top. 3 plus 2 is 5. That's my answer. So doing the same thing here. My common denominator is just multiplying these two together. So I will have to multiply this side by cosine, and whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top, and this one here by sine. Now what I get is cosine times secant, and I'm going to rewrite that secant as cosine. And all of that is over cosine x times sine of x. And then I'm going to subtract out sine of x times sine of x, which is the sine squared. The reason I wrote this as cosine right here is because now you can see these simplify away and give me just a 1. So what I have on the top is 1 minus sine squared. And what I have on the bottom is the cosine x times the sine of x. Now I can go to my formula sheet because I have a sine squared and I have that 1 that's added or subtracted to it. So I'm going to copy down my formula, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And I'm going to rearrange it, keeping the 1 positive. If the 1 is positive and I have to have it with a sine squared, I should subtract the sine squared to both sides. That is going to give me cosine squared equals 1 minus sine squared. Now you can see this is identical to this, and I can replace it with this. So I'm going to put my cosine squared on the top, and on the bottom I have cosine x times the sine of x. Once I have this point, I can eliminate one of these cosines on the bottom with one of these cosines on the top. Because remember, this just means cosine x times cosine x. So one of those can go away. Now I'm left with a cosine x on the top and a sine of x on the bottom. And I know cosine over sine is simply cotangent, which is my answer. All right, let's try this one. It's very similar. We have two terms that are being added together, and you will notice my only strategy I can use right here is to write this tangent in terms of sines and cosine. So I know that tangent is equal to sine of x over cosine of x. And then I still have that sine of x on the top. That stays on the top. Because it's multiplication, I can write it like this, pushed together. And this is added to cosine of x. Now, I could write this top here as sine squared if I want to, and I will actually go ahead and do that. So I'm going to write this as sine squared. Again, that squared goes between the sine and the x, and that's over the cosine of x. And I have plus cosine of x. Now, I have to put this over 1 because this is a fraction. I need to make this a fraction. And now I have to add these together by finding a common denominator again. So this is going to force me to multiply both the top and the bottom by cosine. Then I have sine squared plus cosine squared on the top, and on the bottom I have just a cosine. Now I have sine squared plus cosine squared, which we know equals 1. So I'm going to replace that with a 1. So I have 1 over cosine of x. You're not quite done. Don't leave it there. You can simplify this further. This is the same as secant. That is my answer. All right, you try it. You try problem number 14 on your worksheet. Pause the video, and if you get stuck, you can come back, but try it first. The first thing you need to do is write everything in terms of sine and cosine. So this is 1 over cosine of x. This is cosine of x over sine of x. And then I have a cosine of x over sine of x. And then I have just a cosine, which on the top, cosine times cosine is just a cosine squared. If I take and push this together, what I have is this. The reason I can do that is because it was multiplication. 1 times cosine is just cosine, and on the bottom I have cosine times sine. So now I have two fractions that are being added together, actually subtracted, so I have to find a common denominator. I have to multiply both the top and the bottom here by cosine. Reason being is because I have a cosine times a sine, and I need to make that the same there. So what I now have is the cosine of x minus cosine to the 3rd power, and this is all over cosine of x times the sine of x. Now remember, what you cannot do is you cannot say, oh, these cosines are going to go away. These, like that, they do not go away because the cosine on the top is all connected right there. So what I need to do is I need to be able to identify that both these are divisible by cosine. All right, both of these are divisible by cosine. So I'm going to factor that out. So I am going to take a cosine and factor that out. So that's dividing this by cosine and this by cosine. Well, cosine divided by cosine is a 1. And let's look at this. This is cosine to the third. That's cosine of x times cosine of x times cosine of x. And this is just a cosine of x that I'm trying to divide out. Well, one of those go away on top to bottom, and what I'm left is the cosine squared on the top. And on the bottom, I have cosine of x times the sine of x. Now, what you're probably going to notice is you now have a cosine squared with a plus or minus 1. So now I can go to my formula sheet and say, hey, I know sine squared plus cosine squared is equal to 1. And I can rearrange this keeping the 1 positive, and I need it with a minus cosine. Well, that's easy. Just subtracting that cosine to both sides. And when I do that, I now have this right here, the same as this right here, so I can replace it with this. So I have a cosine of x times the sine squared of x. And on the bottom here, I have a cosine of x times the sine of x. And now you can see my cosines do simplify away because everything on the top is multiplication. Likewise, it's multiplication on the bottom. So then you can simplify one term away. If there were a plus or minus, you could not do that. Then I have one sign on the bottom, and I can take one of those. And what I'm left with is only a sine of x on the top. And that is my answer. All right, one more problem to try. It's problem number 13 on your worksheet. So you have things in terms of tangent and cotangent, and you need to get everything in terms of sine and cosine here. So start with that, and then find a common denominator to combine these. Pause the video. All right, the first thing you should have been able to do is put everything in terms of sine and cosine. It looks like that. So check your answer, make sure it's correct. If it's not, make sure you understand how to do this, and then write it down, and then you can proceed with the problem. Now, I'll give you a hint here. The next step is to take this denominator, and it is to find a common denominator. So leave the top alone and just work with the bottom, finding a common denominator. Pause the video again. You will need to multiply both the top and the bottom by the sine here, and here both the top and the bottom by the cosine x, so you have a common denominator. In doing so, what you have here is you have a sine squared on the top over sine of x times cosine of x. And then on the right-hand side, I have a cosine squared of x over sine of x times cosine of x. And there's a plus sign between there. I now have a common denominator, so I can combine these. My denominator is going to stay the same. And on the top, I have sine squared plus cosine squared. And sine squared plus cosine squared, hopefully you can identify that that is equal to 1. So I will replace that with a 1. And keep in mind, this fraction, or what I just did right there, is the denominator of this messy fraction already that I had there. So this is on the top. And now this looks super, super messy. But what I can do, instead of having this go up and down, I can have it go across. And I can write this as sine of x divided by cosine of x divided by, and then I have 1 over sine of x cosine of x. And the reason it's nice when I write it like that is because now I know when I'm multiplying fractions or dividing fractions, I can't divide. I have to change it to multiplying by the reciprocal. So I won't change anything on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, I'm going to make that a sine of x cosine of x over 1. And now I can multiply everything across like this. And you will now notice I have a cosine on the denominator and the numerator that simplify away to a 1. And now I have sine of x times sine of x, or sine squared of x. And that right there is my answer. You now have the ability to finish all of your problems on 5.1a worksheet. So you will finish whatever you have left, check your answers on Schoology, and then submit it. Have a great day.